On a Sunday evening in the summer of 1852, the walls of the McAllister plantation echoed with laughter. Silver spoons clinked against porcelain bowls. Hymn songs still lingered from the morning sermon, and the aroma of stew filled the dining hall like incense before an altar. But before the last amen of the day had faded from memory, every smile at that table would twist into a scream. It began with the children. Their giggles faltered mid-breath, replaced by sharp gasps. The eldest son clawed at his throat, eyes bulging, as if invisible hands were squeezing the air from his lungs. The mistress dropped her spoon, porcelain shattering against the floor as her lips turned blue. The master staggered back from the table, foam spilling from his mouth, rage and terror burning in his gaze, but he could no longer shout commands. By the time the neighbors rushed in, they found the family sprawled on the floorboards, bodies contorted, stew spilled like blood across the tablecloth. The silence that followed was not the silence of death alone. It was heavier, darker, the silence of retribution, and standing in the shadows of the kitchen was a girl no one had noticed before. She had served the meal with downcast eyes, her small frame bent under the weight of expectation and fear. To them she was nameless, faceless, just another enslaved child lost in the machinery of their wealth. They had never seen her except as hands. Hands that washed their clothes, stirred their pots, scrubbed their floors. But those same hands had crushed hemlock leaves into a deadly paste. Those same hands had stirred the family's Sunday stew with death. Her name was whispered only later, passed in hushed voices through cabins and fields, retold in fragments of memory that survived long after the bodies were buried. Annie. They said she was 14. They said she never spoke much, but her eyes carried storms. They said she had seen too much, endured too much, until silence hardened into resolve. The McAllisters believed themselves untouchable, shielded by land, money, and cruelty. They believed their Sunday rituals and their polished silverware placed them above the people they owned. But Annie knew something they did not. Even the mightiest choke when poison fills their veins. That night in Alabama, power shifted, not with a rebellion of swords or fire, but with a wooden spoon, and a secret that had been waiting for the right moment. And though the McAllister family would die within their own walls, Annie did not scream, did not run. She watched, calm, silent, because when silence finally speaks, it does not whisper, it kills. This is the story of the enslaved girl who laced hemlock poison into her master's Sunday stew and vanished into legend. The McAllister plantation stretched across the Alabama countryside like a wound carved into the earth. White cotton fields shimmered under a punishing sun, endless rows that bent the backs of hundreds, yet enriched only one family. From a distance, the big house stood proud, its white columns rising like false purity against the sky. But up close, the wood was cracked, the paint weathered, and the soil beneath its foundation carried the weight of screams that had never been heard beyond the trees. On Sundays, the family dressed themselves in silks and starch, rode to church in carriages polished until they gleamed, and returned home to a feast. Their hymns echoed across the valley, as if they believed their God belonged only to them. For the enslaved, Sundays were no Sabbath at all. The fields still called, the kitchen still demanded, and the children of the big house needed to be entertained, waited on, bayed. This was Annie's world. She was small for 14, with shoulders slightly hunched as if every step had been taken against a heavy wind. Her skin bore the faint sheen of sun and sweat, her palms hardened by endless scrubbing. But it was her eyes that unsettled those who looked too closely, dark, watchful, always observing. When the mistress scolded, Annie did not flinch. When the master shouted, she did not cry. She bowed her head, yes, but her silence was not submission. It was storage, a place to keep pain, until it became something sharper. Each morning she woke before dawn to the rattle of the iron bell that called the house servants to duty. She would slip into the scullery, where the air reeked of damp stone and soap lye, her bare feet numb against the cold floor. There she scrubbed, polished, and fetched, moving like a shadow from one task to another. When her chores carried her into the kitchen, she kept her head low as the cook barked orders, slicing onions until her eyes burned, stirring pots until her arms ached. The family rarely addressed her directly. To them, Annie was an object, not a person. The mistress referred to her as girl or you. The children jeered at her, spilling drinks or scattering crumbs just to watch her crawl and clean. The master did not look at her at all. unless to remind her of what she was, owned. But Annie saw everything. She saw the way the mistress pressed powder to her face, hiding the bruises the master left behind. She saw the overseer's boots stained from the blood of lashes given in the fields. She saw the way the children mocked her, mimicking their father's cruelty, learning hatred as if it were inheritance. She also saw the plants that grew along the edges of the fields, wild, untended, yet thriving. When she fetched water from the creek, she passed clumps of herbs whose names she only half remembered, whispered once by her grandmother before she was sold away. This one for fever, this one for cuts, this one dangerous. Annie never forgot. Though her mouth spoke little, her mind whispered constantly. It whispered in the rhythm of her chores, in the scrape of the brush against the floorboards, in the steam rising from boiling pots. The whispers asked questions. How long must I endure? Who will ever answer what they've done to us? And slowly the whispers began to change. What if they could hurt too? What if silence could strike back? At night, when the house quieted and the cicadas sang, Annie would lie on her pallet in the servants' quarters, staring at the dark rafters above. Sleep rarely came. Instead, she remembered the whip cracks she had seen in the fields, the cries of her own mother as she was dragged away years earlier, the hollow faces of men and women around her, broken yet unbroken, surviving one breath at a time. These memories pressed into her chest until they became more than grief. They became fuel. Still, she kept her silence. To the McAllisters, she was harmless, invisible. That was their mistake. They mistook silence for emptiness, when in truth, silence was storage. On the Sunday that would be remembered in whispers for decades, Annie's day began like all others. She rose in the half-dark, washed in the basin, and hurried to the scullery before the bell finished ringing. She swept ashes from the hearth, fetched water, chopped vegetables, and stirred the morning porridge. The mistress's shoes clicked against the floor above, her shrill voice calling down demands. The master's boots followed heavy and slow, the sound of a man who thought the world belonged to him. By noon, the house filled with the smell of roasting meat, bread rising in the oven, and the stew that simmered at the center of the feast. Annie moved like a shadow, unseen but always there, pouring, fetching, obeying. No one wondered what she thought, what she felt. No one saw the storm coiled tight behind her stillness. The McAllisters believed the Sabbath meal was a celebration of their order, their power, their God-given place above others. But Annie knew something different. She knew that sometimes the quietest corner of the room carries the sharpest blade, and as she stirred the pot that afternoon, her silence deepened, not as a servant's silence, but as a predator's, because predators do not need to roar. Sometimes they only need to wait. The McAllister family ruled their plantation the way a storm rules the sky, with noise, with violence, with no thought for what it destroys. Their cruelty was not always loud. Sometimes it came in small humiliations, cutting deeper than the lash. Sometimes it came in silence, in the simple act of looking through the people who served them, as if their lives were no more than shadows cast on the wall. Annie had lived in that shadow all her life. But in the summer of 1852, the shadow grew darker. It began with the mistress, a woman who bathed herself in perfumes and pearls yet carried poison on her tongue. Her voice cracked like a whip through the hallways, each command laced with disdain. She would ring the little brass bell on the table whenever Annie was too slow, forcing the girl to sprint across the floor, kneel, and obey. Once when Annie accidentally dropped a plate, the mistress struck her across the face with a candlestick. The cut left a faint scar that never fully faded, but the mistress's cruelty was not the worst. The master, Thomas McAllister, was a man built like the land he owned, vast, harsh, unyielding. His word was law, his temper unpredictable. He carried a riding crop even inside the house, flicking it against his palm as though daring anyone to defy him. Annie had seen him whip grown men in the fields until their backs ran red, not out of necessity but out of rage. She had seen him drag a boy no older than 12 to the post for stealing a handful of corn, beating him until his cries dissolved into silence. One evening, as Annie served supper, the master noticed her pause too long while setting down a dish. His hand shot out, gripping her wrist hard enough to leave purple marks. He leaned close, his breath heavy with whiskey, and hissed, "Faster, girl. Don't make me remind you who you belong to." That night, Annie lay awake on her pallet, the bruise throbbing like a brand. For the first time, she did not only feel fear, she felt something colder, sharper, the beginning of resolve. But cruelty did not come only from above. Even the children had learned it. They mocked her, spilled food onto the floor just to watch her scrub, tugged at her hair, called her names they'd heard from their parents. Once, the eldest boy pressed a hot poker near her arm, laughing when she flinched. "Don't worry," he sneered. "You don't feel pain like we do." Annie said nothing. She only lowered her eyes, hiding the storm brewing behind them. The breaking point came in the height of summer. The air was heavy, the cicadas deafening, the heat suffocating. Annie had spent the day hauling water and scrubbing linens until her hands blistered. That evening, the master stormed into the kitchen, furious that supper was late. He struck the cook with the back of his hand, sending her sprawling. Then his eyes fell on Annie. "You," he barked. "You think you can stand there idle? Get on your knees now," she obeyed. Her knees pressed into the hard floor, her head bowed. He raised the riding crop and lashed it across her back. Once, twice, 3 times. The sting was blinding, the pain biting into flesh. She bit her lip until blood filled her mouth, refusing to scream. Her silence enraged him further. He struck again, then threw the crop aside and stormed out, muttering, "Worthless creature." Annie did not move for a long time. Her back burned, tears slid silently down her cheeks, but her jaw stayed clenched. She felt the other servants watching, felt their helplessness. No one spoke, no one dared. That night, as the others drifted into restless sleep, Annie remained awake. Every lash still pulsed against her skin. But inside her, something had shifted. She thought of her grandmother's whispered stories, of plants that healed, plants that killed. She thought of the hemlock she had seen by the creek, its jagged leaves trembling in the breeze. She thought of the family sitting at their grand table, eating from golden spoons, never imagining that death could be stirred into their very supper. For the first time, Annie allowed herself to imagine it. The master choking on his breath, the mistress clawing at her throat, the children's mocking laughter silenced in an instant. She saw it so vividly that it felt like memory, as if her mind had already leapt ahead of time to witness their downfall. The thought did not frighten her. It steadied her. Days passed, each one heavier than the last. The bruises on her back darkened, then faded, but the seed of revenge had been planted. Each insult watered it, each command fed it. Every time the mistress sneered, every time the children jeered, every time the master's boots thundered across the floor, the seed grew stronger, sharper, hungrier. No one noticed. They never did. To the McAllisters, Annie was still invisible, a shadow in the kitchen. But inside, the silence had become something else. Not absence, not obedience, but intent. One evening, while fetching water at the creek, she knelt by the bank where the wild hemlock grew. The plant swayed in the humid air, its spotted stems rising like slender executioners. Annie reached out and touched the leaves, her fingers brushing the edge of death itself. She remembered her grandmother's voice. "A few drops and the cruel forget how to breathe." She plucked a stem, then another. She slipped them into her apron folds, her heart pounding but her face expressionless. That night, she returned to her pallet, lying in the darkness as the cicadas sang their endless song. But for the first time in her life, Annie felt something like peace, not because her pain had ended, but because she now carried an answer. The storm inside her had found its lightning. The first time Annie touched hemlock, her hands trembled. The plant looked ordinary, just another wild weed on the edge of the creek, but she knew better. Its spotted stems and jagged leaves carried power strong enough to kill a grown man. She pinched a leaf between her fingers, lifted it to her nose and inhaled the faint, sour odor that clung to it. Death did not smell like smoke or blood. It smelled like this, subtle, sharp, unassuming. She slipped a handful into the folds of her apron, her eyes scanning the tree line. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made her heart pound. If the overseer found her wandering here, there would be questions she could not answer. But no one came. The fields were busy, the big house demanded, and Annie, as always, was invisible. That night she sat in the scullery after the other servants had drifted to sleep. A sliver of moonlight cut across the stone floor as she spread the hemlock leaves before her. She tore them gently, crushing them with a stone, mixing them with water until the air filled with the bitter scent. Her hands moved carefully, steadily. This was not play. This was craft. When she lifted her fingers to her lips by mistake, she froze, panic flaring. A single drop could mean death. She plunged her hands into the basin, scrubbing until her skin stung. Her chest rose and fell, breath shallow. For a moment, fear threatened to undo her, But then she remembered the riding crop across her back, the laughter of the McAllister boy when he held the hot poker near her skin, her mother's scream the day she was dragged away. The fear steadied into resolve. She would not stop. Not now. In the days that followed, Annie perfected her silence. She moved as she always had, quick, obedient, unseen. But inside she was calculating. She knew the family's patterns. When the mistress liked her tea, when the master drank his whiskey, when the children begged for sweets. She watched their mouths open and close, their throats swallow, never imagining what else might one day slide past their lips. Every spare moment, she added to her hidden supply. More hemlock gathered at the creek, more leaves crushed into paste. She stored it in a small clay jar buried beneath a loose stone in the scullery floor. Each night as she lay awake, she whispered to herself, not prayers, but reminders, patience, timing, silence. Her silence became her weapon. One afternoon, while scrubbing the mistress's shoes, Annie overheard voices drifting from the parlor. The master's deep growl, the mistress's shrill laughter. Sunday supper, the mistress said. Invite the neighbors, perhaps. Show them what good fortune looks like. The master chuckled. No, this Sunday is ours. Just the family. A fine stew. Wine, our children need to see tradition kept. A fine stew. Annie's hands did not falter on the brush, but her heart jolted. The stew was always her task. Chopping, stirring, seasoning. She would stand at the pot for hours, her small hands guiding the wooden spoon. No one questioned it. No one ever had. This Sunday would be different. The night before, a storm broke over the plantation. Rain lashed against the windows. Thunder rolled across the fields. Annie lay awake listening, her body trembling with anticipation. She pictured the family at the table, laughter turning to choking, eyes widening in horror. She pictured herself standing in the kitchen doorway, silent, watching. But with each image came another, the possibility of discovery. What if they tasted something strange? What if the mistress called for her before the poison worked? What if suspicion fell upon her immediately? Her mind spun. Her hands clutched the blanket until her nails dug into the fabric. Fear coiled in her stomach like a serpent. She turned her head and saw the faint outline of the scar on her wrist, left by the master's grip. The memory of pain burned hot. Fear melted. The serpent lifted its head not to coil, but to strike. Sunday dawned bright, the storm swept away. The air smelled of wet earth, the sky clear and sharp. The family returned from church in their finest clothes, the children squabbling, the mistress fanning herself, the master booming with self-satisfaction. Girl, the mistress snapped as soon as her heels touched the porch. See that supper is ready. Quickly now. We've had a long service. Yes, ma'am, Annie whispered. Her hands were steady as she entered the kitchen. The pot sat waiting, the ingredients laid out. She chopped carrots, peeled potatoes, sprinkled salt. The rhythm calmed her, the scrape of knife against wood like a heartbeat. From the loose stone in the scullery, she retrieved the clay jar. She pried it open. The bitter scent of hemlock rose into the air, invisible yet suffocating. For a long moment she stared at it. One mistake and she would join them in death. Her hand trembled. But only once. Then she tipped the paste into the pot. The stew absorbed it greedily, the liquid swirling, hiding the death within. Annie stirred and stirred, watching the poison dissolve until it was indistinguishable from the broth. Her silence pressed against her like armor. Voices drifted from the dining hall. The family laughing, talking, waiting. Annie ladled the stew into porcelain bowls, each one filled to the brim. She carried them carefully, her heart pounding so loudly she feared they would hear it. The first bowl set down before the master, the second before the mistress, the third, fourth, fifth before the children. Each time she bowed her head, her face expressionless. But inside, her silence screamed. She returned to the kitchen, standing in the shadows of the doorway. From where she stood, she could see them lift their spoons. She could see their mouths open. She could see the first taste touch their tongues. Annie's breath caught. The moment had begun. The first spoonful passed their lips without suspicion. The family was hungry after church, their chatter spilling across the table like wine. The mistress dabbed her mouth with a linen napkin, already scolding the children for eating too quickly. The master raised his bowl, savoring the steam. Annie stood in the doorway, her hands folded before her apron, her face expressionless. Only her eyes moved, watching, waiting. The stew was thick with meat and vegetables, rich with salt and herbs. Beneath it all, the hemlock slid silently into their bloodstreams. Invisible, patient, deadly. At first, nothing happened. The family laughed. The children argued over the biggest chunks of meat. The master boomed with self-satisfaction, recounting the preacher's sermon, mocking the congregation for their lack of piety. To anyone watching, it was a normal Sunday meal, but Annie knew. Poison does not roar, it whispers. It waits. The first sign came from the youngest boy. His spoon clattered against the table as his face twisted. He pressed a hand to his stomach, groaning softly. The mistress frowned, scolding him. "Don't make faces at the table," she snapped. But the boy's groan deepened into a cry. His small body lurched forward and bile splattered across his plate. The room went still. Then the eldest daughter gasped, clutching her throat. Her spoon slipped from her fingers. Her eyes widened in panic, hands clawing at her neck as if the air itself had abandoned her. The mistress rose to her feet, horror dawning on her face. But before she could move, pain ripped through her own stomach. She staggered back, knocking over her chair, one hand reaching blindly for the table as her other pressed against her belly. The master's booming voice cracked into a shout. "What is this? What's happening?" But even as he barked, his words slurred. His face flushed, sweat broke across his brow. His great bulk swayed, knees trembling. He gripped the edge of the table for balance, veins standing out in his neck as he fought to remain upright. The dining hall erupted into chaos. The children screamed, coughing, retching, their cries piercing. Plates shattered on the floor as the mistress collapsed, convulsing, foam bubbling from her lips. The master staggered toward Annie, rage and fear burning in his eyes. "You—" He tried to roar, but the words strangled in his throat. His body seized, his knees buckled, and he crashed to the floor with a thunder that shook the table. Annie did not move. She did not speak. She only watched. The poison worked quickly now, coursing through veins, shutting down hearts and lungs. The children writhed, their shrieks dissolving into choking gasps. The mistress clawed at the tablecloth, dragging porcelain bowls to the floor in a rain of shards. The master convulsed, spit and blood streaking his chin, his eyes rolling back until only the whites showed. One by one, their voices broke. First, the youngest boy's screams fell silent, his small body limp against the floorboards. Then the eldest daughter collapsed, limbs twitching before stillness claimed her. The mistress gave a final, ragged moan before her chest fell for the last time. And finally the master, his breath a rattling growl, his hand outstretched as if to seize her one last time, gave a violent shudder and went still. Silence. The dining hall smelled of spilled stew, bile, and death. Chairs lay toppled, plates shattered, bodies twisted in grotesque final poses, and in the doorway, Annie stood untouched. Her heart pounded, but her face was calm. She felt no triumph, no scream of victory, only a strange, hollow stillness, as if she had become part of the silence itself. For years they had never seen her. Not truly. They had seen only the hands that worked, the shadow that moved, the girl that obeyed. But in death they saw her at last, though their eyes bulged and glassed, their final gaze frozen on the child they had never considered human. Annie turned slowly, her bare feet padding softly across the wooden floor. She did not rush. She did not hide. She moved through the ruin she had wrought with the calm of a shadow returning to night. Behind her, the house moaned with the weight of death. A curtain stirred in the breeze. A bowl rolled in slow circles before tipping into silence. Outside, the cicadas sang. The world carried on, unaware that within the McAllister house power had been turned upside down by a girl with a wooden spoon. The silence after death was different from the silence before. Before, silence had been Annie's shield, a secret she wore across her lips. Now it spread through the McAllister house like smoke, filling every corner, pressing down on every wall. The dining hall still reeked of stew and vomit. Flies had begun to gather, buzzing lazily above the bodies sprawled across the floorboards. The master's hand still reached outward, frozen in his final grasp. The mistress's hair spilled across her face, sticky with spittle and foam. The children lay twisted and pale, their limbs bent at unnatural angles. Their once carefree laughter, now a ghost that seemed to echo against the cracked walls. The house groaned in the afternoon heat, wood settling, windows rattling in the breeze. It felt less like a home now, and more like a mausoleum. In the scullery, Annie sat on a low stool, her hands folded in her lap. Her back still ached from the lash, but she did not feel pain. She did not feel anything. Her eyes drifted to the floor, where shadows stretched long with the sinking sun. She listened to the silence, letting it wrap around her like a cloak. No one came immediately. No overseer burst through the door, no neighbor knocked. Time itself seemed to hesitate, unwilling to disturb the scene. It was the cook who found her first. A heavy-set woman with tired eyes, she entered the dining hall and froze. Her hands flew to her mouth, a muffled scream escaping her throat. She staggered backward, crossing herself, eyes darting from one corpse to the next. Then her gaze fell on Annie, who stood silently in the doorway, expression unreadable. The cook did not speak. Perhaps she understood, perhaps she only feared. But she turned and fled, her cries echoing through the yard, drawing others. Soon whispers rippled through the cabins. The family is dead, all of them. Something happened in the house. God has struck them down. The overseer stormed in, boots thudding, whip coiled at his belt. He stopped cold at the sight, his face draining of color. His lips moved soundlessly, then twisted into a snarl. He looked around wildly as if expecting someone to explain. His eyes found Annie, small and still in the shadows. "You," he began, but the word faltered. He stepped back, a flicker of fear breaking through his rage. For the first time he seemed to see her. Neighbors arrived by dusk, drawn by the cook's screams and the overseer's shouts. They crowded the doorway, men pulling off their hats, women clutching their children close. Gasps and prayers filled the air. Some swore it was illness, some swore it was a curse, others muttered of poison. No one spoke Annie's name, but every eye flicked toward her. The girl who had stood untouched in the middle of it all. They buried the McAllisters hastily, lowering their bodies into the earth behind the family plot. The preacher muttered verses with trembling lips, his hands shaking so badly, he dropped his Bible in the dirt. The neighbors avoided the dining hall afterward, whispering that the air itself felt cursed, that the walls seemed to hum with what had happened, and through it all, Annie remained silent. She did not cry. She did not protest. She did not confess. She walked among the others as if nothing bound her to what had transpired, as if she were only another shadow passing through the ruined house. Yet her presence unsettled them. Wherever she stood, silence followed. At night, the plantation grew restless. The enslaved spoke in hushed tones around their fires, telling and retelling the story. Some said Annie had called upon spirits from across the sea. Some said God himself had used her hand as his judgment. Others only nodded quietly, eyes gleaming with something dangerously close to hope. The overseer drank heavily, pacing the yard with his whip, but he did not touch Annie again. He avoided her eyes, muttering under his breath whenever she passed. To him, she was no longer just a girl. She was something else, something untouchable. Inside the big house, the rooms lay empty. The dining table remained overturned, bowls cracked, stains spreading across the wood. Servants entered only when necessary, and always quickly, whispering that they could still hear the family choking if they listened closely. Some swore they saw shadows moving in the corners at night, shapes hunched over the table, reenacting their last meal. Annie heard the whispers. She felt the stares, but she carried them lightly, as if none of it touched her. When she lay down at night, she closed her eyes and heard not the screams of the dying, but the silence that had followed. A silence she had carved with her own hands. A silence that would never leave the McAllister house or the land that fed it. In the weeks that followed, the McAllister plantation withered like a tree struck by lightning. Crops stood in the fields but seemed cursed, their stalks yellowing too early, their fruit rotting before ripening. The great house remained quiet, its windows staring blankly over the land like empty eyes. No one wanted to sit at its table again. No one wanted to scrub the stains from its floor. Even when the boards were washed with lye, the smell clung sharp and sour, as if bile and death had soaked into the very grain of the wood. Neighbors began to whisper of omens. Some said the family's ghosts walked the hall, replaying their last supper each night, bowls rattling on unseen tables. Others swore they had seen a small figure moving past the windows, long after the house was abandoned, and always. The name rose in hushed voices. Annie, the girl who had stood untouched while an entire family fell. The girl who had never screamed, never wept, never confessed. No one saw her run. No one saw her leave. One day she was simply gone. Some claimed she slipped into the woods, vanishing among the pines where no hounds could follow. Some whispered she had crossed the river under cover of night, moving north toward freedom. Others believed she was taken by spirits, that the very forces she had called upon to poison the McAllisters had claimed her as their own, but the truth was never known. Annie left no footprints, no farewell, only silence, yet silence itself became her monument. On dark nights, when the cicadas hushed all at once and the air grew heavy, the people swore they could feel her near, a child's shadow standing just beyond the lamplight, watching, waiting. Mothers warned their children not to wander alone, lest Annie's eyes follow them through the dark. Men who mistreated their servants claimed to wake choking, as though invisible hands had laced their breath with poison. The legend spread far beyond Alabama. Preachers spoke of it in trembling sermons, calling it the devil's work. Storytellers whispered it around campfires, their flames flickering low, as if afraid to burn too brightly in her presence. Among the enslaved, Annie's story became something else entirely. Not a horror, but a promise. Proof that even the smallest, quietest among them could bring down a house built on cruelty. Her silence became a weapon. Her calm became a warning. And though years passed, though new families took the land and raised their own children in the shadow of that cursed house, none ever stayed long. Doors slammed on their own. Floors creaked with phantom footsteps. The dining hall remained colder than the rest of the house. No matter how many fires were lit, every owner spoke of dreams filled with choking, of shadows moving in the corner of their eyes. Eventually, the house was left to rot, its timbers sagging, its windows broken. Vines clawed up its walls, reclaiming it piece by piece, but the legend never rotted. It lived in the whispers of those who remembered, in the fear of those who had heard, in the hope of those who dreamed of freedom. They called her the Hemlock Girl. They called her the Shadow of Silence. They called her Annie, and they said that on certain Sundays, if you pass the ruins of the McAllister place at dusk, you can still smell stew simmering in the air, rich, savory, laced with something bitter. If you linger too long, you may hear a child's footsteps behind you. If you turn, you may see her, small still, watching with hollow eyes. And if you sit at her table, if you lift the spoon she offers, you may taste the same silence that swallowed the McAllisters whole. Because some meals, once served, never truly end. And so the tale of Annie, the Hemlock Girl, lingers like a shadow, a story never buried, a silence that still speaks. If this story unsettled you, if it crawled beneath your skin and made you feel the weight of history and horror, then stay with us. This channel is where forgotten voices rise again, where folklore and fear entwine, where justice and darkness share the same table. Subscribe so you don't miss the next story waiting in the shadows. Like this video if you felt the chill of Annie's silence. And tell me in the comments, what do you believe happened to her? Because here, stories don't end. They only wait for someone brave enough to listen.